No, I was not in a charitable mood in any way. I could have, well, for 3 months she demanded that I come to her studio in Chelsea by 6 a.m. And this, mind you, was after we'd already worked until midnight or 1 a.m. the night before. She wasn't even on a strict deadline, but after seeming failures to her anyway, she often worked as if on a deadline. Walking into her studio for the 4th month in a row after doing little else nearly made me hate her. Yes, fine. Yes, I was bothered. I might have even told one of our friends that I hated her, or that I was about to hate her, or that the thought had crossed my mind, at least that morning. It was not only due to the long hours, I was afraid that we expended all this effort on something that might only be shown for a month, or even just a week like boxers had. Normally I wouldn't care. Beautiful art is obviously worth the effort, even if nobody ever sees it but yourself. And I told myself over and over again that that was enough. There was magic in ephemerality, like Mendietta's work, to be one of the few to ever see it, and not only to see it, but to have worked on it so intimately for so many months. But then I would think about those months, and how many months and then years I'd expended on these epics, and no matter how much I wanted to believe in that magic, I found that I just kept thinking about how this was just another Celia Merode piece. Nobody knew Vicente Rojas. Maybe even myself. Your interviews over the past few years, I might add, haven't exactly helped this. Because every time you bring up something trivial like our work dynamic, I finish the day thinking only about that, how I hadn't worked on any of my own art in months. And sometimes I think about that for more than just a day. I think about it for a week, a month, and by that morning in September, I might have convinced myself that the lines between Vicente and Celia had finally been corrupted and devoured whole by her need to work. It might have been true. It was probably true. And that was why, maybe for the first time ever, she had to call me when I did not arrive at the appointed time. First my home phone at 6:45 a.m., which I let ring through once, and when it stopped ringing, I brushed off the receiver and left it dangling from the bedside table. She then called my cell phone, which she had purchased for me in our work together. I'd never wanted one, and these 6:45 a.m. phone calls were perfectly good reasons to never want one. But I knew she'd try calling that as well, so I turned it off, beating her to it. When I turned the phone back on at 7:50, I listened to 3 increasingly livid messages. I decided to leave the phone off during my walk to the studio because I prefer to be yelled at in person when I can be a presence. Her studio was quite large, an old warehouse space in Chelsea. The ceilings were 20 feet tall. 3 columns stood across the middle of the room, each of them painted white by both of us years earlier. Around the same time, Patrick moved his gallery to Chelsea. On the west side of the building, windows overlooked the Hudson River, before taller buildings, condos, were erected between us. Depending on what we worked on, the studio could be quite clean for a pair of artists. She often kept it immaculate for either photography or video shoots. Half of the space had once been mine, but it slowly shrank over the years, to the point that I no longer knew if I had any space at all. When I walked in that particular morning, the studio felt cluttered, as it had for 3 months, and not just cluttered for Celia, but genuinely a mess with all the props we had built for her next monolithic project. It was similar to the first 2, but this time videos would be projected from 4 different directions, and we'd create a forest filled with creatures both real and mythical, and the viewer could wander through it. She hadn't even worked out the logistics of this piece, but She already had me build a series of shamanistic bears, a black angel to be burned at the stake, creatures that appeared to be all mouth. I heard her working behind a pallet of sculpting clay, so I squeezed between a pair of robed bears and gruffly said hello. She scowled at me. I thought she might throw a small hammer between my eyes. And she said, "Where the fuck have you been?" "Sleeping. We've worked late every night for 3 months." "Sleeping?" she said. "I've called more times than I can count. Why didn't you answer?" "Because I needed to keep sleeping." And she said, "You could have just said so. I was worried about you." "Worried about me? Worried about me or whether we'd ever finish this project?" And she said, "Fuck that, Vicente. You know that I'd worry about you over the work. Then why are we doing nothing but work?" And she asked, "Since when don't you want to work?" Since we started doing nothing but your work." And she said, "What do you mean my work? Everything has always been both of us." "Oh, seriously, Celia, whose name goes on everything that we've done for the past 3 years?" I don't know how long they'd gone on, but I just then noticed sirens outside, screaming down the West Side Highway. She said, "You want to work on more of your stuff? We can. I want to work on any of my own art. When and where am I supposed to do that?" She waved a hand at the room and said, "Here, I've given you all of this space." "Where? Where, Celia? This is all your space. Where do you see my work anymore?" She looked at one of those fucking bears I'd fabricated. Before she could offend me herself, I said, "The bears will have your name on them." And she said, "You're a working artist. What does it matter if it has my name on it? This is why friends shouldn't work together. But I don't even know if you're even my friend." And she asked, "What is that supposed to mean?" "You're just my boss now, Celia, and I'm just some faceless assistant, just like I am to Patrick and all the other gallerists. Have you even mentioned my work to them?" I thought I heard an entire fleet of trucks backfiring far away. Then the sirens grew louder, different kinds of sirens, all around us. Then she said, "Why is it my job to mention your work? You have a mouth. You talk to these people all the time." "No, I might talk to them, but they do not talk to me. They do not see me. They only see you. More than one of your collectors has insisted on calling me Vincent, and when I tried to correct them, they scoffed at me. And Patrick, he's asked me at least a dozen times if I do any of my own work. I used to think that he actually cared. Maybe he was even interested. But by the 3rd time that I described my work to him, I realized that he'd never even listened to me. And he never would. I'm completely invisible to him, to all of them. What would Anna think of this dynamic?" Everything. Our breath, the blood circulating through our hearts, it all stopped for the longest second of my life. She looked at me, first, as if I'd just mentioned a ghost that she'd forgotten had been watching over her shoulder for the past 15 years. And then she looked at me as if I had just crossed some unfathomable line. And she nearly shouted, "You're being dramatic! For some people, sometimes there is real drama in life, Celia. We don't all get first-class tickets to one giant art party after another." The noise outside overpowered even our argument. And then she yelled, "You know it's not easy for me! I am a 36-year-old woman, and I still never get to do what I want to do!" But the noise outside was finally too much. She looked out the western windows and screamed, "Why are there so many fucking sirens right now?" We both looked outside. We saw the Hudson River. And we saw New Jersey. But nothing seemed amiss. We just heard these sirens howling past us. It's really hard to explain. Even now, you see, even a month after the attack, there was still this haze of gray dust lingering all around us. And we were based 3 blocks north of the pile at Respite Center 1. Of course, we could have been a lot farther away, and the smell would have still been. I still can't pinpoint it. Jet fuel, chemicals from things like fluorescent lights, melting steel, bodies. Cadaver dogs zip-lined up and down the piles of debris, but the guys clearing everything out, they said you didn't even need the dogs because you could usually smell the bodies. The Red Cross set up Respite Center 1 in the old St. John's University building on Murray Street, and that was basically my home for the 3 months that I was in New York. Yes, I do national disaster response for the Red Cross, but everything before Ground Zero felt small, no matter how big it was. I remember Hurricane Andrew absolutely devastated so many towns in Florida, but this was even more destruction, much more death. It was just compacted into the footprint of 2 very tall buildings. By that first Wednesday morning, I was driving from our house in Nashville to New York. Yes, all the airports were shut down, you probably remember, and it was deceiving coming into the city. Most neighborhoods, you couldn't really tell much had changed. People went to work, kids played in parks, but when I went downtown, when I saw the pile for the first time, I thought the whole world was ending. Now I can still see the jagged frame of what was left of one of the buildings standing there in the skyline, looking like an elephant's rib cage, like some lion had torn into its bones. The pile was smoking hot, and it didn't stop smoking the entire 3 months I was there. There were so many trucks hauling away debris, and those trucks were always hosed off to keep the dust down. Hundreds of workers would line up to get their boots hosed off before they left the site. Then they'd come to us at Respite 1 or 2. All day we provided a place for police, firefighters, our emergency crew to come and get a bite to eat, or take shelter, get some counseling, medical care, or just find somebody to listen to them talk. I assisted the 12 to 8 shift supervisors, so I met Celia right away because Vern, he assigned her to greet people at the door. She watched these men lug themselves into the building, and she directed them to whatever they were looking for, like food, therapy, a place to rest, the room for friends of Bill, chiropractors, masseuses. We had a lot of amenities by the time I left. And these men always carried the pile in with them. No, I don't mean like physically, like the dust on their clothes. I mean like, what am I trying to say? If a firefighter just laid body parts onto a stretcher, you could see it in the way he'd look at you. If a police officer opened a victim's wallet and saw what the man looked like with his 3 kids, he'd hold himself differently for the rest of the day. At first, I don't think Celia knew what she'd signed up for. Not that anyone did, really. I called her apartment continuously. I called the studio continuously. I went to her apartment and I went to the studio. I went back to her apartment, but I heard nothing in that entire first week. I had no idea what had happened to her. Everything was still so on edge, and we heard so many rumors about follow-up attacks. I was afraid something happened to her after we'd parted ways on Tuesday evening, after we'd spent the rest of the day together, just constantly watching the television or trying to go for walks along the Hudson. After a week, her phone number finally appeared on my cell phone. I flipped it open, practically screaming at her. "Where have you been? I've been so worried. Are you alive?" At the end of the first week, I made a point to eat with her during break in the cafeteria. I'd seen her talking to the emergency workers from time to time, but as far as I knew, she hadn't talked to anyone else. I was concerned that she'd internalized too much, everything the workers brought back from the pile. I asked if the seat was taken, and she just gave me this vacant look, and then she looked down at the empty chair, and she looked back at me and just shook her head. No, the chair wasn't taken. I set down my tray of spaghetti and garlic bread and asked her how she was holding up. She waited, seeming to think about it while she twisted noodles onto her fork. I remember she had this really dry monotone when she first talked to me. She said, "One of these guys found a man's torso today." I wasn't expecting her to talk about somebody else, but I remember that being the first thing she said to me. She said, "Another body part was embedded into the chest. The cop who found it assumed it was the man's own hand, but after he looked closer at the wedding ring on the finger, he realized it was a woman's hand." She looked at me for a while before taking another bite of pasta, but I don't think she was looking for a reaction. The tone of her voice had never changed, so I wasn't sure if that was her answer to my question or if I should ask again. Maybe in a different way, but in that same tone, she said, "Another one of these guys keeps finding kids' shoes, just empty shoes." And she said, "I've never had a stranger fall into my arms like that. He tried really hard to not cry. I cried, but he kept saying, 'Nobody's seen me cry in 40 years. I can't cry.'" And she said, I told him to cry. I said, "Please cry. It's okay." But he was afraid that if he let himself break down, that there was something wrong with him, that he was nuts or something. And so he just kept holding it in, and it made him hiccup, and his neck jerked around in this really sad way, but he really didn't want to cry. She didn't say nothing for a while, and I thought she was staring through me when she finally said, "So I could be worse." I let that settle for a second before I asked her if she'd ever volunteered for something like this. She said, "Has anybody?" I meant for a disaster in general. She said, "I've never done anything like this in my entire life. This is the first time I've ever done something I've so fully misunderstood, probably ever." So I asked what she normally did, but she just said, "I'm a volunteer here." I started to say I meant, but she stopped me and said, "This is what's normal right now." I watched her twist more spaghetti onto her fork. I didn't know how to respond. I needed to listen, like we did for all the emergency workers. After she swallowed, I realized that I stared at her. I hadn't meant to stare. I didn't want to offend her in some way, and then she said, "I'm sorry." And she shook her head a little, maybe at herself, and she said, "This is all just so strange, and I haven't really talked to anyone all week. I've mostly just listened." She stopped for a moment and looked down at her plate, and then she told me what she did before she volunteered. "If you really want to know, I just make videos for rich people." She said that to her plate while spinning her fork into more noodles. She mumbled, "I just make videos for rich people. Nothing important." I asked if she meant she did something like ads, advertising. She looked up at me and said, "Something like that." She took another bite of bread, and I assumed that was the gist of it. She didn't say otherwise anyhow, and didn't seem interested in saying nothing more about what she did. But I wanted to hear a little bit about her story, so I said, "A lot of New Yorkers tell me they feel a real need to be here. Maybe like it's family, even if you didn't know anyone who worked here." She swallowed her food and drank from her water bottle, and she shook off a little bit of that monotone and said, I've lived in New York since 1983, so I guess that's already 18 years now, half of my life. When I first moved here, I came from Iowa. I grew up in Iowa City, and I always knew where I was in Iowa City. In New York, though, by myself, 18 years old, I suddenly had to figure out a lot of things on my own for the first time. I'd get out of a subway station and I had no idea which direction I was going in. I didn't know if I was walking north or south, or if I'd somehow gotten off in New Jersey by mistake. I didn't know what the hell I was doing in those first few days and weeks, but I realized that at least in lower Manhattan, if I saw the World Trade Center, I knew that was south, and so I got my bearings after a few months, but I never really let go of that idea. So every time I saw those buildings, I thought of them as being my compass needle, and I could get where I was going because of those buildings. And even if that wasn't true half the time, it always felt that way, so it became true. After a while, it became a part of my truth, whatever that might be. Those buildings might have been ugly, but they became a truth for a lot of us. No, she'd never called into the gallery, which was kind of rude, you know? We didn't know where she'd been that morning, or for months after. Was she there? Kelly got really upset looking for her. She let Kelly think she died. No, I didn't think Celia died. You can't kill Celia Merode.
As the days went on and the pile never seemed to shrink and the dust never settled, some of us started telling each other that the sun still rises. Now, I don't know who said it first, but it did actually seem incredible that something so simple could still happen. We were surrounded by all of this destruction. They still hauled the dead away. Firefighters still stood and saluted the bodies when they passed. The trucks still carried away tons of debris, and the dust, it covered everything right down to the backs of our throats. But somehow, in the middle of all that, the sun still came up every day. And Celia, she was at the door telling us so. After a while, I noticed that Celia knew a lot of the men who came through our doors. She got to know them before they went out on another 6-hour shift. They'd stop and hug and maybe check in on each other. She stayed late after most of her shifts ended, and I'd see her playing cards with the men. She created these small moments of normalcy for these people. As great as that was, Vern and me, we were concerned she wasn't getting no rest. She usually asked if she could come in on her weekly day off. We had to tell her to stay home. In the first 6 weeks, it was fine, and she was reluctant, but she always stayed home on Wednesdays. But after some time, she stopped Vern on a Tuesday in a classroom that we turned into an admin office. She said, "Vern, I'd really like to keep working through the week. May I come in tomorrow?" He gave her that very Vern, warm, sympathetic look and said, "Celia, I know you want to stay on at the door, but we gotta look out for your health too." She said, "The people out there know me. They expect me at the door." Vern agreed and said, "We appreciate you. They appreciate you, but even they get a day off to recuperate." They did, but as the weeks wore on, a lot of those men never wanted to go back home either. I made friends with guys on the construction crews who couldn't imagine going back to their old lives. I don't know. I think it was a sense of purpose. The work was grueling and monotonous, and on a basic level, that probably wasn't much different from what a lot of them normally did on a daily basis. But at the pile, there was a community and a sense of purpose that made a lot of people not want to go back to their old lives. Celia told Vern, "Please, don't make me stay at home." He sighed. I know he empathized with her. He said, "Maybe it's a good idea to get out of town for the day. Get some real fresh air." She said,
I don't want fresh air.
So Vern said, Celia, I'm telling you, not as a supervisor, but as a friend, please try to go get some rest and relaxation tomorrow. And I was stunned when she said, I just stand at a fucking door. I don't need rest. The few of us in the room all watched. Vern said, Celia, I know this is an emotional place to be, but please don't swear at me. She slumped into herself and shook her head, and Vern stood up and he hugged her, and she mumbled into his collarbone, Please don't make me go back, I can't. Vern patted and rubbed her back and said, It's one day. You'll come back and you'll feel rejuvenated for the next week. I'm sorry to say, but I don't think we'll need to close these posts for a very long time. And the Red Cross did stay for a long time, much longer than I could.
3 months had passed and I realized it was time to go back home to Tennessee. My husband pleaded with me to please come home. He worried about me. I told him not to worry. Everything was fine. At least as fine as it could be. But I guess I understood, at least a little bit, what Celia felt. But I don't know if I ever really understood her. It was literally years later, more than a decade later, that I learned she was a famous artist. She never told no one about that as far as I know. You think you know somebody after 3 months? We only had those 3 months. When it got cold in December, Celia finally went ahead and did it. She came in on her day off. She got past security because she had the Red Cross badge, and as soon as we saw her walking through the door, Vernon and I looked at each other and knew it wasn't a good sign. He walked up to her and put his arm over her shoulder. He directed her away from anyone else and said, You know it's Wednesday, right? I think we're pretty well staffed today. He didn't want anyone to hear. Everyone did love Celia. He told her that she could stay for the day. We could find something for her to do, but if she came in on another day that she wasn't scheduled, you'd be forced to revoke her official volunteer badge. And she, of course, didn't listen. She came back on a day off the next week. She didn't walk into Respite 1, but she was seen walking around the streets by the pile, talking up the emergency crew guys, more or less getting in the way. Now, Vern, he hated doing it, but he had to have her escorted out. And that was the last time I saw her in real life.